Hello to our friends, family, stalkers, and strangers. Welcome back to another episode of Creeps and Coffee. I am Kait. You'll notice I'm missing a counterpart today, and that's because I'm doing something quite exciting, and I'm very glad that you guys can join me for it. This is my very first solo episode. This is my first chance to take on Creeps and Coffee in a Kate-centered way. Not that I don't do most of the talking anyway, so sorry, Jamie. But I am at the helm by myself today, taking on one of the most exciting episodes for me. So I'm really glad to have the chance to sit down one-on-one with you guys and really just have a chat about some history and some spooky stuff in the best way that I know how. So tell Jamie you love her, tell her you miss her, because I love her and I miss her, and she'll be back for the next show. But for now, strap in, folks. We're jumping back in history. We're going to talk about the plague.
I'm Kait.
And I'm Jaim, and this is Creeps and Coffee,
a show where we talk about the dark parts of the world around us.
Cryptids, conspiracies, things that go bump in the night,
and the crimes behind the scariest creatures of all, humans.
Join us as we take a look at the stories sure to give you the creeps.
Pull up a seat, grab a coffee,
and let's have a chat.
So when I came to Jamie with the idea of doing a solo episode totally on my own, she was very receptive. I felt like it was my duty. She's really picked up the slack regarding the podcast since my entire life changed, basically. So I give Jamie a lot of credit for that. And I approached her with the idea that our schedules weren't really working. Maybe I could take on some extra responsibility here and try to do an episode totally on my own, which is not daunting for me because I talk to myself 90% of the time, and most of this podcast is just me listening to the sound of my own voice anyway. Sometimes it's just Jamie laughing. So while I do miss that confidence boost of Jamie laughing, I like to think of her editing this and really enjoying that. But in approaching the topic, Jamie said, absolutely, what do you think you want to talk about? And I went back and forth on a couple of different ideas, but ultimately, the one that kept coming to mind was the plague. Which, now that I say it out loud, probably slightly concerning that my last episode was about leprosy. This one's about the plague. I promise I'm not dying. I promise I'm not diseased. These are just really interesting concepts to me. And I think our episode on leprosy is actually kind of what got me thinking about this and about the way that we as a world, really, I was going to say the cliche, we as a society, but we in general approach disease and illness. It's definitely a very different perspective across history. There's been many a pandemic, many an epidemic of different diseases and illnesses, and each one seems to come with its own unique challenges, you could say. And when it comes to the plague, specifically in Europe, I think there's a lot to be said about the history that still stands from it and kind of the approach that can be taken from a historical and from a more spiritual, paranormal, I don't know how else you would approach it, kind of standard, because there's a lot about the plague that shifted society as we know it and shifted our desire to learn more for modern medicine. There's a deep history behind how it was handled, how it wasn't handled. History in the not too distant past has repeated itself in a lot of aspects when it comes to that. So it's been on my mind. That was a very long-winded way of saying that the plague has been on my mind. And more specifically, a village in England where the majority of stories that got me interested in the plague ended up coming from. I'm a big sucker for documentation and historical documentation, and not in the sense of there was one specific representative that was responsible for town meeting notes and stuff like that. While that's interesting, I'm a big sucker for a notebook from history, of seeing the firsthand experiences and the first person perspective of historical events from everyday people. A good example of this, there's a historical site not far from where I live called Frank Slide. Long story short, the town that used to be Frank, Alberta, was a large portion of it was crushed by a landslide, a rock slide from the side of Turtle Mountain. It crushed a huge portion of the village, houses, people, all of that at like 4 o'clock in the morning. I would love to do an episode on the Frank Slide, but that's not the point for now. The point being, at the museum, at this historic site, they've found journal entries and telegrams and tiny notes written by people who are describing how it felt like the world was crashing down around them, and how they thought that it was some sort of huge earthquake happening, that it was so scary having their world turned upside down, and how scary it was to not know what was going on. And having those firsthand accounts, and especially being able to see it in writing, is so fascinating to me. Another big one that comes to mind, the last time I was in London, actually, at one of the museums, there was a notebook, one of a handful in the world recovered, just a sketchbook from Leonardo da Vinci. Just seeing his brain rot, for lack of a better word, his word salad out on a page of him just trying to get these ideas and these sketches and these notes out of his brain so that he wouldn't forget them. It makes history feel more personal. And I first learned about today's topic from exactly that, from excerpts, from journals, from writings, from citizens in a little village called Eyam. Now, Eyam is generally considered to be one of the most haunting and remarkable stories to come out of the Great Plague of London. And haunting in a sense of hauntingly beautiful, haunting in a sense of genuine spiritual hauntings, which we will get into. But the story of the plague village of Eyam is really one of those stories that Jamie and I like to talk about, that encapsulates the humanity side of history, but also leans into the supernatural. It says a lot in great detail about how people come together to protect each other, and the importance of having a community in being resilient. So that's a really long-winded way of introducing you to the plague village of Eyam. And that's where we're heading today. So Eyam is a small village in north central England in Derbyshire. And I feel immediately in saying that it's supposed to be like Derbyshire, but that also feels stupid. So we're just going to stick with Eyam. And we're going to take it back to September of 1665, when a shipment of cloth was ordered by the tailor in Eyam from London. This fabric happened to be infested with fleas that were carrying the bacterium that was responsible for the plague. Now I'm going to give a very quick, brief overview of the plague situation and of Eyam and the more historical aspect. So the tailor's assistant, a man named George Vickers, was the one who handled the cloth, opened the box, went to take stock out, did his thing. No one was the wiser. Within days, he became the first victim of the plague in Eyam. He fell ill, he passed away, and the disease spread rapidly throughout the very tightly packed village. The village of Eyam had a population of approximately 800 people, between 7 and 900, so I'll go with the median there and say about 800. And word got around very quickly that something significant was happening. But at the time, no one fully understood how the plague was spread. But the results were devastatingly clear. People were dropping, and no one understood why. And it came to a point where the rector, a man named William Mompinson, and a former Puritan minister, a man named Thomas Stanley, made an extraordinary, shocking proposal to the village. The entire village would quarantine itself to prevent the plague from spreading to nearby towns. Now, Eyam was not far from places like Sheffield and Bakewell, where there were more people who could potentially be affected by this, and they didn't understand what was going on necessarily, but they knew that if they could control it, they were responsible for keeping their neighbors safe, and they would hope that their neighbors would do the same if they were in that circumstance, which, if we look back at COVID, I hate to say it, we all knew it was going to get brought up. We all hoped that people were taking the same mindset there as well. So the difference, obviously, with the plague being that this was not enforced by the government. It was a collective moral decision. And the villagers agreed that their quarantine would work in the sense that no one would leave Eyam, and they would place boundary stones around the village. So people would know not to enter, and they knew how far they could go on the quote-unquote outskirts of the village. They still needed food, they still needed supplies from other villages nearby. So they kept doing business, but they warned others to keep a clear distance, and they took as many precautions as possible. Food and supplies were left outside the boundary stones by neighboring communities, and they were still paid. They were compensated by coins that had been soaked in vinegar in an attempt to disinfect them before we had disinfectant, as we know it specifically. There was no Lysol that was killing 99.9% of plague germs. This was a coin soaked in vinegar and left on a rock in hopes that there would be some honesty in the people who noticed it and the supplies that were dropped off. So, to consider how the plague really affected the village of Eyam, between 1665 and 1666, around 260, give or take, who knows how many, of the villagers died from the plague. And again, this is out of about 800 residents. That's a significant portion of your friends, your family, your neighbors, people that you are seeing every day and deeply involved with. This was entire families that were being wiped out across generations. And the heartbreaking aspect is because people weren't being brought in to do the typical funerary shtick, survivors often had to bury their own loved ones. They were kind of left with the entire process of processing the body, burying it, having a service of whatever their belief was. And that was really difficult to process when you also couldn't lean on other loved ones because people were sick or people were stressed. So it definitely did not create a happy environment, but the resiliency that was created within the community was astounding. And one of the most famous and heartbreaking stories regarding family passings within the village of Eyam was the story of a woman named Elizabeth Hancock. And I'll get a little bit more into her and her story when it comes to talking about the more personal encounters and the supernatural aspects of the village of Eyam today. But a quick overview of Elizabeth Hancock is that she was basically the widow of the town. She buried 6 of her children and her husband herself in a place that's now known as the Riley Graves. So think about having to bury 6 of your children and your partner and then continue to live your life day to day. I, especially as a mother now, I cannot imagine. And it quite honestly gives me full body chills, even considering what that would have been like. And kind of to go back on what I was saying there too, is that to reduce the spread and to keep everybody safe, the people who were passing away, while yes, they had funerals and were able to have small services, you still didn't want big gatherings because, while yes, the entire village was quarantined, you didn't want to take the risk of passing something on to a family that hadn't directly been affected, or someone who was being portrayed as not having contracted the bacterium. So it very quickly became an even more difficult process, considering a funeral is already not something that anyone enjoys. So church gatherings were also moved outdoors. Services for church and for funerals and anything where large group gatherings would typically be indoors were held in natural amphitheaters. So big hillsides, areas where there was plenty of fresh air and plenty of space to be several feet apart. A good example of a natural amphitheater that would have been used would be a little place called Cucklet Delph. That was a natural amphitheater that was used quite often for these gatherings. And even in terms of individuals' homes, people were losing their homes. They were abandoned because infection was starting to spread from house to house. I mean, they were getting comfortable with their neighbors because those are the only people that you're seeing, and they're passing along this bacterium. And it really became, as terrible as this word is, given about 6 years ago what happened, it became a pandemic, and it tore through this village just like it would tear through the entirety of Europe, especially around this time. Luckily for the village of Eyam, by November of 1966, the outbreak had burned itself out. And this is widely because of the sacrifice that these villagers took in quarantining themselves and really committing to that quarantine. So it's very likely that the sacrifice saved not only hundreds of lives within their community, but thousands of lives in the long run, considering the villages surrounding them and the repercussions that would have come from them being affected by the plague. And I mean, everything spreads like a wildfire, especially when it comes to bacterium. when it's being passed this way, the way that the plague was, through rats and cats and all of these things, there's really no stopping it once the ball gets rolling. So their sacrifice was huge. And I don't want to discredit that. I don't want it to be viewed as though I'm looking at that as a minor feat, because I'm absolutely not. But the truth of the matter is, you guys want to get into the more supernatural aspects of things. And I don't want to bore you with in-depth history, because I could go into this for an insane amount of time. But there's also that spookier element that I do want to jump into, because I think understanding that human element first is integral to being able to appreciate the spirits that remain there today. So Eyam today is preserved as a historical site, and many physical traces of the tragedy remain. So they have what they consider buildings called plague cottages, where families or individuals would go once they knew that they had contracted the illness, and they would basically quarantine themselves in a specific cottage with other people, other family members potentially, who also had the plague, where they knew they couldn't give it worse to someone who already had it, and they would bond together and essentially live out their final days in a group to reduce the risk of other loved ones or other individuals in the village also contracting the plague, which I think is a huge sacrifice, given the fact that they already quarantined as a village, and they were so selfless in wanting to protect other people that they were willing to make this huge change in a time when they very likely needed support more than ever emotionally from their loved ones. But the risks really outweighed the benefit when considering that your loved one could potentially get sick and pass away as well. The extra downside of these plague cottages was that nothing could necessarily be done until everyone within the cottage died. And that means that a lot of circumstances were, unfortunately, that people would pass away in the cottages, and the living still had to exist within that household with the dead bodies of their companions basically rotting away, because no one really knew if interacting with dead bodies would give you the plague. No one really was comfortable going into a place where other people had contracted it and were residing full time. Very few people were willing to take that risk for themselves, which, to be quite honest with you guys, I don't know that I would take the risk if I were in that position, especially at a time where there's very little understanding of medicine. In terms of other historical markers that are still relevant at Eyam, the boundary stones can still be seen in the surrounding countryside. You can still see kind of where their make-believe borders were set up. Not make-believe, but their self-inflicted borders were put up. And particularly the Riley graves still remain as a really chilling memorial to what devastation was occurring within the walls of a place that was looked at as really respectable and commendable. The reality of the intensity behind those boundaries. Because of the intensity of these emotions and the sheer amount of death and destruction that the plague caused, there are also many lingering ghost stories and eerie traditions about the village of Eyam. And there are lots of reports of apparitions near the graves. There's lots of discussion about certain parts of the village having just a heaviness to it, where cottages feel oppressively cold and there's heavy silences which, to be quite honest, is completely expected when there is just so much emotion. And kind of to go back to what I was saying at the beginning of the show is I think that's what draws me to the story of Eyam. And I hearken it back to my time in theater. I'm sure if you've been listening to the show for a while, you've heard me mention that I was a theater kid. You can take the girl out of the theater, but you can't take the theater out of the girl. I always will be a theater kid. And I understand how insufferable that is and how I can be sometimes. However, a big aspect of theater is the thought of a ghost light and how theaters bring in so much paranormal activity, not because people are dying in theaters or there's these big tragic backstories or Phantoms of the Opera in every performance area, but because it's a place that brings in a lot of emotion. And any place that carries a lot of emotion and it acts as a large venue for social gatherings where all of those emotions and spirits can be in one place together, end up being a hub for a lot of spiritual activity. Hotels are very similar. There are people dying in hotels probably more often than theaters and auditoriums. However, the concept remains the same, right? There's a lot of people passing through. A lot of emotion comes along with every individual. So when there's high traffic in an area, when there's intense emotions behind something, it doesn't need to be a physical death that occurred in that place, but the emotions can stay. Now, thinking of Eyam, there's heavy emotion, but there's also obviously a lot of physical death that occurred as well. So it really culminates into kind of a spiritual melting pot of activity that's still considered quite high to this day. Eyam is often remembered for the tragedy, but more specifically, I think it's for the collective sacrifice. I think very similarly to what Jamie and I were talking about with the leprosy island just off the coast of British Columbia, where they sent men of color or of Asian descent who had leprosy off to this island and abandoned them. This notion that it's so easy to push people who are different or ill outside, especially if it's not understood, and push them away, cast them out, and forget about them. This is the complete opposite, right? Where this village took it upon themselves to recognize the strength in community and the strength in selflessness, and they took it upon themselves to action those thoughts and action that belief in order to protect the people around them. And the moral of the story there is that these villagers chose the greater good over personal survival, which at the end of the day is how humans as a species have survived as long as we have. We're quite stupid creatures, especially considering all other living creatures around us. And our main survival reason, I firmly believe, is community. And that idea that the greater good is what's important. We can't let that selfishness be our downfall. That's a major aspect of hubris that could take us down, but it refuses to. To be completely honest, right now in history, it's starting to a little bit, but that's a completely different topic. However, the story of Eyam is still one that is largely talked about. Again, like I kind of alluded to earlier, there have been many different pandemics, epidemics around the world, across history, and the plague is kind of the one that we know right off the top of our head when you think major health disaster around the world. Historically speaking, obviously there's a different one that we all think of that comes to mind quite quickly and quite recently in history, but we've seen it time and again. And the idea that this one village sparked so much conversation in 1666, but is sparking equally as much conversation, if not more, in 2026 is crazy to me. And I think there's a lot to be said in discussions in public health ethics with the world changing the way that it is. I think the village of Eyam is really a case to be looked at for a lot of different reasons. But I promise now we will get into the good stuff, because obviously, while the history is very exciting and very important to me and my brain and my heart, spooky stuff is too. And the darker folklore of Eyam comes from the fact that the tragedy left more than just graves. There were generations of unsettling stories that came out of this village. And I think it's really important to talk about how grief echoes through time, and whether that has more of a human element, more of a supernatural, folkloric element. I'll leave that up to you. That's a completely subjective, up for debate notion. However, I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive. I think they can exist in tandem, and I think they do exist in tandem. And we're gonna dive into that, because I think that's just as important in recognizing what the village of Eyam truly is. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the Riley graves, particularly because they're already one of the most heartbreaking sights you can imagine. These 7 grave sites that this poor mother and widow had to make for her family. Again, as a mother now, particularly a new mother, where the postpartum anxiety and postpartum thoughts are still quite prevalent in my brain, which, as a quick side note, is absolutely fucking insane. The amount of insane scenarios that have popped up where I'm like, oh, I hope I didn't forget my baby in the blender, that would never, ever occur, but my brain is like, no, you definitely did it. The postpartum brain is fucking nuts. And the way that I approach movies and television and even other podcasts, and now research that I'm doing in my own interests like this, are really, really affected by me becoming a mother and entering into that anxious and overprotective brain process. And immediately, in thinking about the Riley graves, my heart aches, because I cannot imagine mother to mother, partner to partner, ever having to consider doing that. And from a supernatural aspect, the grave sites are also probably the most haunted spot in Eyam, because, again, going back to what I was saying about heavy emotion really having an impact on supernatural presence, you can imagine, even without being a parent, that the loss of 6 children and a husband would have a significant emotional toll on an individual, particularly when you're in a town where you can't go anywhere to get away from that memory. You can't go anywhere to escape your thoughts for a minute. You can't lean on other people for support, because everyone has to be independent. So it heightens those emotions, which strengthen the potential connection to the ether, if you will, to the spiritual world. And obviously, the aspect of death does suggest that there could be some spirits of the children, of the partner, and of Elizabeth Hancock herself that remain by the Riley graves. The most heartbreaking aspect to me about a common description of the apparition of Elizabeth Hancock is that she'll often appear around her children's graves, counting or searching, as if she's still tending to the family that she lost, which kills me. And a really common detail also about this is that if they're not seeing an apparition, people will at least describe an intense, quiet heaviness. And that again ties into the emotional, or the oral, I guess, oral in the sense of like AURAL, not the other one, Jesus, but the spiritual oral connection to a haunting, which, if you want more explanation of the different types of hauntings, we have one of my favorite episodes we've ever done called Hauntings 101, all about different paranormal connections. But now we're in history class, not Hauntings 101. So another thing that is kind of connected to the darker folklore of Eyam is the plague cottages, like I mentioned before. Now, what's very unsettling to me about these plague cottages is that they're known as the breathing cottages. So certain plague cottages are tied to this deeply unsettling phenomenon where guests and residents, people exploring these areas, have reported hearing faint breathing or whispering at night. And cold spots will appear. Doors are said to creak open slowly, especially in the less common buildings that are older and untouched and that sort of thing. So there's just a heaviness in the air, quite literally the heaviness of the breathing, but also an emotional intensity. And again, legend suggests here that these aren't ghosts in the usual sense again, but a more residual energy, replaying the final hours of those who died alone, basically, inside these cottages. Another major aspect is Coquelet Delph, that area that I was talking about with the services that would happen outdoors, with the larger social gatherings that would happen at these sort of outdoor amphitheaters. Coquelet Delph was probably the main area. So during the plague, a lot of these church services were held at Coquelet Delph, which was a quite secluded natural hollow. And locals to the area, people who frequent it, will say that at twilight, you can hear faint murmured prayers coming from the area. Visually speaking, people have seen shapes that resemble a gathered crowd between the trees. And there are some reports that there's almost a pull or an urge to stay silent or bow your head as if you're walking into an ongoing service and you don't want to interrupt. You want to pay your respect to the service that's going on. And emotionally speaking, there's this persistent idea that comes from the residual haunting in this particular area that the final desperate prayers of the villagers never fully stopped. And while I'm not a religious person, that really tugs at my heartstrings, thinking that their spirits are so firmly confident that there's something more and confident that their prayers will be answered. And I think, again, that ties back to the resiliency of the community, and thinking how hard it would have been to kind of approach that topic in prayer and hoping for the best. And I think that's, well, I definitely wouldn't want to walk into a circumstance like that personally. I think that's a very commendable energy to leave behind. And I think it's very comforting for the area itself. Going back to the boundary stones as well, obviously plenty of emotion surrounds those stones and surrounds what they stood for. That sense of, I want to say entrapment, but encapsulation of preservation, this feeling that you really can't escape. Even though, again, it wasn't an electric fence. There weren't guards threatening to kill you if you went over the wall. It was a community decision, a selfless decision for the greater good. But no matter how many times you tell yourself that, it doesn't make it easier. And it adds to the heaviness, where even though you know that you're doing the right thing, it still doesn't feel good. And a lot of the boundary stones that marked Eyam's quarantine boundary carry their own sense of unease because of that not good feeling. There's been quite a few travelers who have claimed to see figures standing just beyond the stones, watching, observing, not in a judging way, just curious about what's going on. Others describe hearing footsteps that stop abruptly when they turn around. And in older tales, particularly recent-ish years that followed the opening of that boundary, crossing the boundary at night was said to bring bad luck or illness. Not the plague, just illness. One piece of folklore that comes out of Eyam says that the spirits of villagers still guard the borders and ensure that no one breaks the quarantine even centuries later. So making sure that they stay together as a village, no matter what. One more unsettling aspect, not that any of this is settling, is the notion of the plague pit and the legend behind these mass graves that were scattered around the area. Obviously, there's a large percentage of the village passing away. There's not a lot of opportunity to properly dispose of these bodies, and it ended up requiring several mass graves around the village that are said to sink or shift slightly, especially after heavy rain. And this concept made me think of when Jamie and I were in New Orleans, going to a lot of the original cemeteries in New Orleans, where everyone's buried kind of freshly under the ground, not necessarily as deep as we would go today, or slightly above ground, and how after storms bodies would kind of wash up. So it's definitely a very different process than what we would do today. But apparently animals will avoid these patches of land, and a few stories describe faint scratching sounds beneath the earth. These tales are likely much more legendary. Hate to break it to you. I don't know what's up with me lately in these spookier episodes, but I sound like the skeptic. I promise that's Jamie. It's not me. But these specific tales are very similar to the fear around this time of being buried alive. It's the reason some grave sites at that time had bells attached, or for people they thought were vampires that would come back to life, or witches, iron cages would be put over top. So this is not a new concept historically, but it does tie in here as well. So the overall feeling that resides in Eyam now isn't visual at all. And I think that's a really interesting aspect to talk about, because it's said that it feels less like entering a haunted house or some ghost town, and more like stepping into a moment that never fully ended, as if the world and the spiritual world in tandem with that just hit pause. And there's a shared feeling of everything being contained and sealed off, as if it's kind of the only place in the world. It's said that sound seems to carry quite oddly in the village, where it's too quiet in some places and too sharp and abrupt in others. And there's a recurring sensation of being watched. But I feel it's also important to point out that watched, not threatened, where you can tell that people are just watching over and keeping an eye on things as they would have done. Which is equal parts comforting and upsetting to me. But what I want to get into now very quickly is some lesser known personal stories that come out of Eyam. Again, like we talked about, a lot of the documentation we have of these experiences comes from journal entries and writings and firsthand accounts of people that survived the 1-year quarantine and came out to tell the tale. So while well-known figures like William Mompensen and Elizabeth Hancock were integral in cementing the intensity of the emotions in this history, Eyam was a small town. There was a lot of individual little stories that had just as much importance, and I think it's really important to talk about them. So one that's of particular interest to me is the tailor of the village, and what I imagine was a horrific experience for him, knowing that his order for stock for his shop was the reason that all of this was happening. Everyone remembers that the plague came in bacterium that was on the cloth, but fewer people talk about the emotional weight that would have been carried by Alexander Hadfield, the tailor himself. He was the one that ordered infected fabric, and his household was among the first affected. It was his assistant that was the first death, but it didn't mean that he was unaffected. And although he wasn't ever blamed outright, he kind of became a recluse and lived under this shadow of guilt. And a lot of retellings of the lore of the town will say that he became increasingly withdrawn because he convinced himself that he had brought death to his own people, to his own neighbors. And that's a burden that would have been impossible to shake in a village like that, where everyone really does know everybody. Another humanly haunting aspect, and the lesser known stories here, are the children who were left alone. We think of stories like Elizabeth Hancock, where it's absolutely devastating for a mother to think of losing her children, but it's often forgotten that the opposite happened as well. And when entire families died, there were an unfortunately high number of children who were left temporarily orphaned, hiding in their houses or in the streets. and surviving on scraps. There are accounts of children wandering between empty homes, trying to find food, of older siblings trying to care for younger ones with no guidance. And we're not talking an 18-year-old taking care of a 15-year-old. We're talking 6-year-olds taking care of infants. And in some cases, help was too late or never came. And while these stories rarely made official records, it's those personal touches and personal accounts from things like parish notes and oral histories that get passed down that really maintain the importance of the story and maintain the reality for a lot of these children, where parts of Eyam briefly became just a village of unsupervised and grieving children. We all know as adults how difficult it is to lose a loved one. A lot of older adults are still grasping with how they're ever going to cope with the thought of losing their elderly parent, let alone these children who are dealing with it in early childhood and being left to fend for themselves. It's a horrifying concept, and thinking about the spirit world and obviously not knowing how it works, but I would imagine that it's a horrifyingly guilty experience for a parent watching over their child, knowing that they left by no choice of their own and they don't know how their child will fare. No, it's definitely a very unsettling concept. I feel like I've said unsettling a lot in this episode. The last one I kind of want to talk about, I did have a handful more, and if anyone would like more information or like a few more tidbits from these personal stories, I'd be happy to share them on Instagram, on potentially a Patreon episode, whatever the case may be. But I wanted to bring attention to another specific group that kind of gets glossed over in the history of the village of Eyam, and that is the grave diggers. So while a lot of people were taking on the opportunity to bury their own loved ones, a lot of people still weren't comfortable with that and wanted to go ahead with your kind of stereotypical process. And there were formal grave diggers, but there were also people who kind of had to step up and take care of digging the graves when it became too much for one or two official grave diggers to do. So a handful of men and occasionally women became de facto grave diggers, and they worked in near constant exposure to the infected. Not just in terms of thinking of a plague house and trying to get a body out from there, but keep in mind that the plague was a bacteria. It didn't immediately pass away when the host body passed. So in dealing with these bodies freshly after death, there's constant exposure to this bacteria, which immediately raises the gravedigger's risk of becoming infected. And many of them died very shortly after taking on the role. So there's a quiet tragedy to the gravediggers, and there's a further sacrifice in what they decided to do. And it ended up being that those who were trying to bring dignity to the dead often followed them within days or weeks. And the cycle continued because someone would have to bury them. They're at risk, and so on and so forth. Again, there's a handful more personal experiences, but the overarching pattern that I want to get across without droning on here is that what stands out in these lesser known accounts isn't fear, it's not the scariness, it's isolation, and it's people dying alone, it's families being completely wiped out, and it's survivors that are carrying memories that no one wanted to revisit. So what's important for me to get across to you all here, in being either your first exposure to the village of Eyam or an added element to your knowledge on the topic, is that Eyam's history isn't only about the collective sacrifice, it's about the invisible struggles that were going on behind closed doors and the private grief that was being carried by these individuals in the town who were kind of having to push it aside in order to look at the greater good. So it's a huge element to the history of Eyam. And I think it's very important to bring up that, again, as I do with all historical recounts, to point out that while this is a very interesting story, these were real people who lived this firsthand. And I cannot even imagine what that was like for them. And to kind of wrap all of this up relatively quickly is the point I was alluding to earlier, that the story of Eyam is especially powerful because we're not relying on oral history only, we're not relying on legend, we're not relying on folklore. We are relying on the real, first-hand, written, recorded accounts from the time. They are oftentimes not these huge, lengthy diary entries, but very similar to Da Vinci's notebook that I was talking about, where it's scribbles, it's word vomit, it's stuff thrown out on a page to get it out of their brains to stop them from ruminating. Some of it is just facts, and it's just record keeping. Some of it is more emotional. It's more chilling than legend, I think. The human element is what makes it more chilling. And the two main sources that we collect information from are letters from William Mompesson and his personal notes, and Eyam's parish burial register. So the register was basically death as a list of them trying to keep track as best as they could of the villagers who had passed away. This is one of the more chilling ones because while it's obviously very intense to think about how many people had passed away and to have that so blatantly pointed out in front of you, but the idea of not having long notes or emotional accounts written down, but just having a list, it shows really how normal this became, which is incredibly unfortunate and incredibly heartbreaking to consider. And there would be multiple deaths recorded on the same day, with entire families being listed within days of each other. So a typical entry would look like the month saying you buried John, his wife, their son. No adjectives, no explanations, no further details about who these people were, just names on a page and a rhythm of loss that the village fell into. And I think particularly one of the most unsettling details about this register and about these notes is that the handwriting itself changes. It becomes a lot less steady during the peak months of the plague, which suggests a major emotional and physical toll on whoever was recording this register. It shows that they're becoming tired and broken down and grieving for their village, not just for these people, but for the village as a whole. And I think there's a lot to be said in that, but also nothing further to say, if that makes sense. Another pointedly blunt approach to the documentation from the plague village comes from Mompenson's letters. So William Mompenson wrote several letters during and after the outbreak of the plague, which included letters to relatives and to officials in nearby towns. And one of his most quoted lines describes the plague as a dreadful visitation. But his writing goes deeper than that. The idea of a dreadful visitation is obvious, but he describes watching the village die by saying, "The condition of this place has been so deplorable that I persuade myself it did exceed all that you ever heard of." This wasn't hyperbolic. This wasn't a major dramatization. It was him communicating that the intensity of what the entire village was feeling was beyond description. And despite the fact that he even acknowledged in his writings that the village collectively decided that the infection, quote, "the infection was spreading into the country," unquote, and that there was conscious ethical choice from all parties, he was still dealing with heartbreak and loss and documenting it. William Mompenson's wife passed away in 1666, and this is where we see his records really start to change. He wrote of her death with a lot of restrained grief and described her as the joy of his life, as though once she was gone, all of the joy that he had was also gone. And following her death, he never left Eyam again, even once the boundaries opened, and he continued to minister to the sick and the dying. So from his notes, from kind of the coroner, we'll call it, the list of the dead, there was a sense of control and documented readiness and organization, but there's also controlled devastation. And it's quite obvious that they handled it as best as they could, which is very shocking given the time and the general lack of consideration for emotion and how something traumatic like this could potentially be affecting the village. But they were quite in tune with their emotions and the emotions of each other. Again, these records are just, again, I feel like I've said unsettling a million times in this episode, but there is no better way to describe it. These records are so unsettling because these documents aren't trying to scare you. They're not fictionalized versions where everything is hyperbolic, everything's over-exaggerated. They are just stating facts. And the fact of the matter is that people died quickly, families were wiped out, and life was not sunshine and rainbows. It was survival and burial. That was it. There's very little direct commentary on fear or grief or horror, just their existence. And it makes you wonder, or at least it makes me wonder, what they were really feeling, because the people who were living it had to live it every day. They didn't have the time to get caught up in the grief or the fear or the horror. They didn't have the strength to embrace it, because to embrace the scariness and embrace the reality of the grief that you're experiencing takes a lot of strength. And when you have to keep going, sometimes that strength isn't what's necessary at the time. Is that the most healthy way to approach it? Probably not, but that's beside the point. And because they couldn't acknowledge that, because they had to keep going, they couldn't even put it to words. So all that's left is what stands in Derbyshire, in north central England, with the village of Eyam and the bones that are left behind of a village that sacrificed itself. And that's it, to a T. I wish I had something more philosophical to say. I wish I had something more poignant, but all I really can say is that this story is one of the most shockingly haunting to me in many aspects, but mostly because of the human element. And I say it to Jamie, I say it to you guys all the time. History is so cool and it's so important to understand history and to learn from it so that we don't make the same mistakes. But in the case of the village of Eyam, I think there's a lot to learn from, to mirror. And I think that idea of selflessness and community and working for the greater good is not a lesson from history that needs to be avoided, but the complete opposite. I think, particularly in today's day and age where there is a lot of division for a lot of different reasons, and in a world where everyone feels that their feelings are the most important, like I alluded to at the beginning of the show, humanity's not going to survive that way. We will only survive if we take care of each other. And that's my big lesson to come out of this episode, is embrace each other. Maybe not physically, because that's how we spread the plague, but embrace your neighbors, care for the people around you, and take care of your emotions, because that's the only way that we're all going to get through this together. If this village can get through the plague and come out on the other side, we can all do whatever's being thrown at us. And that's that. All of that to say, it was a pleasure to sit with you guys and talk about the village of Eyam. As I mentioned, there's plenty of other aspects that I could go into on this topic. So if you would like to hear more about the village of Eyam, if you would like to let me know what you think, if you have any questions, comments, concerns about anything I've talked about today, please feel free to get in touch with us over on our email, which is creepsandcoffee@gmail.com. You can send us a DM, leave us a comment on our Instagram or our Twitter @creepsandcoffee. Or if you really like and would like an even more in-depth look at some of the personal letters and historical concepts that are coming out of the village of Eyam, you can check out our Patreon, which is patreon.com/creepsandcoffee, where you can get a exclusive look at some behind the scenes stuff that we do for the show, access to bonus material, including a very special bonus episode every month. We are so thrilled and so grateful that we have the community that we do, and we are elated to think that if the plague were to come back, you guys would be the best village to quarantine together with. And we just are very grateful for all of you. And I hope you know that. Thank you for listening. We hope you are having a wonderful day, night, afternoon, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. Jamie and I love you, and we are looking forward to chatting with you again very soon. Goodbye. I love you.
Creeps and Coffee is produced and edited by us, Kait and Jaim.
Our theme music is Stuck in a Hole by Dated.
For more information on where to find them, check out the link in our show notes. And to connect with us, follow us on Instagram and Twitter @creepsandcoffee.